going to reintroduce Jenna because that's already been done. Amani Haydar. Amani is a lawyer and an artist, a mum, an advocate for women's health, safety, and she serves on the board of Bankstown's Women's Health Centre. Amani takes a multidisciplinary approach, that's English is a terrible language, to raising awareness about gender-based violence, law, policy, and the effects of structural inequality for women. I'm sorry, your surname. Oh, Baulch. Thank you. Sorry. As I said, English and me, not at one. Moo recently ended a 6-year stint as the CEO of Domestic Violence New South Wales. God, that must have been a hard ride. The state peak body for specialist. Now I can't even read English anymore. For specialist domestic and family violence women's services. In that time, she's seen huge changes occur, and she's been proud to be part of that change. She was a social justice and gender equity leader for more than 20 years, and in the international NGO sector, and a lifetime commitment to addressing family violence, social inequality, and human rights abuses. And Sharron, chorister extraordinaire. Sharron has worked in women's refuges for over 30 years. During her role as manager of Jessie Street Domestic Violence Services, Sharron developed a special interest in the issues affecting older women. She found that older women who had contact with the service often experienced violence and abuse at the hands of their own adult children and were reluctant to seek support as they held the perception that women's refuges were generally only for younger women with children who are escaping intimate partner violence. So these amazing women have a lot to offer. Thank you.
Hi folks, and I love the fact that I'm in a room full of women because normally when I do a domestic violence panel and it's half-half, none of the men come back for this panel. So it's lovely that you're here, thank you. I want to talk a little bit about Counting Dead Women Australia, which is a part of Destroy the Joint, which is a Facebook group I'm involved with. And I also teach full-time at the University of Technology, Sydney. This is not to talk about me because really just, not that interesting, but I'm going to get to the good bit in a minute. Anyhow, so there's a bunch of women who do Counting Dead Women Australia. They're really meticulous about checking that the deaths have actually happened and it was as a result of fatal violence against women. And then one day I was just going through the millions of emails I get, and this young girl, she was still a young girl then, and to me she's always going to be a young girl, her name was Noor. She said to me, look, I'm sorry, I'm going to drop out of honours. And I went, why? You've got all this ability, why are you throwing this out? And she said, well, you know that page that you're involved with, Counting Dead Women Australia? I said, yes. And I thought, where is this going? And she goes, well, my mother was on that list this morning. Anyhow, at that point I thought, God, I'm harsh. Why didn't I just immediately say, okay, darling, that's fine for you to drop out? So by the end of the conversation, which started by email, then was me phoning her because I wanted to boss her into staying into honours. Both of us were crying. One of us was crying for a much more serious reason. So Noor's mother was murdered, and that was how I met Amani. So Noor is the sister of Amani. I have taken it upon myself to boss the two of them endlessly ever since that moment. And I would just like to ask Amani to speak first about what happened in her family, how we met, whether she's sick of me bossing her around yet. Amani.
Thank you, Jenna. Is this working? Yes. Okay. So my mum was murdered in March 2015 after a very long and abusive marriage with my dad, and it was predominantly emotional abuse that she experienced and a lot of coercion and control. She had arrived at a point in her life where she was ready to separate from him and had bought her own place and established herself in her career so that she could be independent. And he just, divorce was not something that he wanted for himself. And the murder took place in that context after so many years of almost divorcing and her trying very hard to work out what to do to get herself out of that marriage. So Noor was a student of Jenna's. I also went to UTS, and I don't remember the precise moment that I met you.
I'm glad. I feel like I've always been there, just nagging.
But I do remember that when it was time for us to give our victim impact statements at court in my dad's trial, I thought of Jenna as someone who would be a supportive person to have there. And she came along, and I also thought to contact her when the Western Sydney University presented my mum with a posthumous award for some studies that she was in the process of doing when the murder took place. So she was a counsellor and worked for a little while in community welfare and was pursuing further education at the time of the murder. So a lot of what I like to talk about is how my mum challenges some of the ideas that we have about victims and the ramifications that crime has had on myself and my siblings, and still now in 4.5 years down the track, having all the time. Yep.
Thank you for not discussing my nagging. So I think one of the things I'd like to draw out from that is the idea that we have that all people who experience domestic violence are victims. Moo, can you tell us that time just after the person has decided to leave, has finally been able to, get the courage together to leave? Can you tell us about what happens in that moment of time?
Yeah, look, firstly I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Aboriginal land and pay my respects to elders past and present, and I'm sorry I wasn't here this morning for Yvonne's Welcome to Country. Yeah. And thank you for having me here, because I have left the space that I was working in, and it's a real honour to be back in the room, so thank you for having me. We know that there are a few points where there are particularly dangerous times, and one of those is when a woman makes the decision to leave. We also know that for many women it may take multiple attempts, and it may take a really long and sophisticated pathway of planning to be able to get to that point where you feel confident enough to be able to leave. But certainly that period where you're contemplating leaving or just having left is a very, very dangerous time for women, and we see that in terms of often in family court. Sharron's choir was singing about that awful situation that occurred back in 1996, I think it was. That is all too common a situation, and similarly, what Amani and Noor and your family have talked about really publicly, I think is starting to shift Australian consciousness around some of those things. In this sector, we've known for a while that there's a real, there are really dangerous times. We know when women are pregnant, often that can be one of the most brutal times in terms of the violence that women experience, which makes no sense to us when you think about all of the myths that we have around society and new lives growing. It seems completely counterintuitive that violence would increase, but it also fits quite neatly with the complete lack of respect and dehumanisation that a perpetrator of violence has in their head when they're using this sort of abuse.
Thank you. Sharron, you've written and sung really beautifully about the multiple points of challenge and how women feel. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience of writing those stories and how you found doing those?
Well, I've always I've been very interested in music, and as a songwriter, I mean, I don't believe that there's any more powerful way to convey a message than through music. And unfortunately, I had enough material to draw on. I could probably write 3 more albums of similar songs, although, you may want to slash your wrists after you've heard some of them. But my experience working in domestic violence services for the past 30 years, I'd probably just like to not do Domestic Violence 101 and jump to the reason that, we're here today. We're here to talk about violence against older women in particular. Certainly that young women, particularly women who are pregnant, are at the highest risk during during the continuum of violence with a partner, but that there's an invisibility around older women and their types of violence that are perpetrated against them, even to the point where when they reach out, if they reach out to some of the helping services, they don't fit into the category of domestic violence because they're seen as intimate partner violence. But what I saw working for 13 years at Jessie Street was that we were having women present to us in various ways who are escaping violence from their own adult children, and that was part of the cycle not being broken. And the unspoken taboo of the perpetrators often being their female adult children. And it's very confronting as a worker and a woman and a feminist to believe that this can happen. I understand, the dynamics around it, understand that, generational violence is going to come out somewhere, but it was more than that. It was a society problem. There were women escaping violence from their adult children that was driven often by drug addiction, and the problem of there being inadequate services for people with addictions to be able to get the help that they needed, and the stigma that was attached to those women admitting that it was their own children, they were being turned away often, sadly, from the domestic violence line because they didn't fit into the category of DV. And, for them to come in, often they would say that I've been abused, but they wouldn't say who the abuser was. And there was a lot at stake. For some of them it was that they were going to be, that their grandchildren were being held to ransom. If you don't give me some money, if you don't give me what I want, then you're not going to see your grandchildren. And, when it comes to intimate partner violence, who could be more intimately connected to another person than their own child and the mother? We found that we had to work very differently, and we had to challenge other workers in the field to actually, to see this as a problem and open the doors for these women, and what's more, go out and do some assertive outreach and let people know that, that the stereotypical scene of the woman and the two little children fleeing an abusive husband wasn't necessarily the norm for all women.
And how hard is it to do that assertive outreach? I mean, we're all thinking as we're watching this, can we actually insert ourselves? Can we be good bystanders? Because I've just felt the mood just really sink because this is all too depressing, I'm just going to shift quickly to something about trying to improve the situation. So we know that we have to be better bystanders. We know that we have to be able to look for solutions. So we don't have, I think I'm right in saying this, we don't know that we've got rising rates of family violence. What we do know is that we've got much better reporting rates of family violence. Those of you who were ever involved in domestic violence 30 years ago knew that the police were utterly hopeless. They are a lot less hopeless now. Is that a compliment? A lot less hopeless? I'm not sure whether that's a compliment. So if we're thinking about ways to actually get the rate to drop, what are some of the solutions? Amani? Or Moo, go. Yep.
I think, okay. I'm a glass half full person. I think we've seen massive shifts in the last 10 years. I think we've seen massive shifts in the last 30 years. But I also think the more that we can work across sectors, we have this nice kind of neat idea of this is the homelessness sector, this is the domestic violence sector. It doesn't work like that in practice. And actually, particularly when you're talking about a community on the ground, and in the case of bystander approaches, what we should be putting massive amounts of effort into now is creating good bystanders across our communities. And it's when people like Amani get up and speak, both within public spaces but also within community spaces. I've seen incredible advances within, believe it or not, religious communities in the last 5 years. So
that's
religious
awesome.
leaders.
Can you give me some examples?
Yeah, well, there's the beautiful father, whatever his name is, from Gosford. I'll give you a perfect
always
example.
good. He doesn't count. Next one.
I'll give you a perfect example. Give you a perfect example. Maha Abdu out at the Muslim Women's Association has brought together, excuse me, a group of men from across different religious and cultural communities, and they are standing up within their own communities. They are spot on in terms of their messaging and their understanding of the gendered causes of violence against women, and they've taken it upon themselves to stand up and be counted within their communities and speak out, and that's where we're going to see the change. It's where it happens at a community level.
Amani, do you agree that it's been an improvement?
I think the improvement has been that at least we're having some more frank conversations about it within community. I don't have a specific problem with that model, but I also don't agree that it should be about giving men who already have power more platform to talk about how that power should be exercised. So for me, what I find really exciting is some of the work that Muslim women have been doing in the spaces that I've been involved in. Perhaps the best example I've come across, and I wish more people knew about it, I was invited earlier in the year to launch a publication in Melbourne with an organisation called the Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights. And they've taken both a feminist and human rights focused approach to providing this resource, which I've brought for show and tell. It's titled Islam and Muslims Oppose Violence Against Women, a guide for women. And it's written by women, researched by women, includes faith-based information that can empower women to navigate the complex situations that they find themselves in their own lives. And for women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, the support that's available doesn't always speak to the specific nuances that they're experiencing. So something like this, which sets out their rights and what the law says, and also provides Islamic grounding for it that they find quite persuasive, is very effective. And I thought it was a powerful resource, and is something that I think, we need probably a New South Wales version, because in the back it's got all the support services and phone numbers. It deals with everything, all the different types of abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse, and it gives women the confidence to confront those issues in their own lives in a way that they can feel at harmony with.
I'm sorry, I'm going to do an Eva right here and say, why are we aiming this stuff at women still? Why are we putting the solutions for the problem in the most disempowered section of the community? They have this information. How do they convey that to those perpetrators?
I'm going to do a Jenna right here and say that, it's really important that we talk to women and persuade women, and it's also important that we speak to men and persuade men. And I reckon we have to have a multicultural, because they're definitely another species to us, blokes, where we have to get all the messages on board for all the people to work together. I am quite persuaded by the idea that that women are in charge of this. I think that's good, but I also think, it's difficult to persuade men, isn't it? How many men do you hear say, "Oh, look, it's other men who are violent"? That is, in fact, that's a whole thing we should talk about now. Is how do we get men to recognise that they, even if they're not violent themselves, they benefit from the kind of society we have?
Well, we don't do it with white ribbon. That's obvious.
100%. Yeah.
I guess building on what I've already spoken about, I don't know, I'm a little bit frustrated about it. I think in some communities it's a little bit harder to distribute the resources in a way that's effective, and it's a bit harder to engage people who don't quite feel that who interpret that engagement as being targeted. So I think that's maybe one way I can put it. So I was invited by the Canberra Islamic Centre, and this was the first time that this model had been used ever, to speak to an audience that, and we hardly ever get this at most events I go to, it's usually a female audience, whether it's within my community or just generally. But we had about half a room of men, and they actually got the imam of that centre to share a microphone with me, and we had a Q&A with the audience. We had my storytelling, and then we had his actual involvement in backing that up. And that was actually really validating for me, because I had negative experiences in religious spaces, and a lot of us had. And at the same time, I use faith as a coping mechanism, and I don't want to not have that resource. So it was a positive thing, and I think maybe that's the type of thing that I'd like to see more of, the conversation going across.
Do you mean in partnership?
In partnership, in collaboration, and the right people speaking rather than just advocates being placed there as
Sure.
like as a symbol.
Yeah,
What do you think?
it reminds me very much. So, kind of 2+ decades ago, I came to this space because I was working in the LGBTI, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, you know, the acronym space. And the first place that I ever got intersected with domestic and family violence policy was the first piece of legislation that we got equality in Queensland back in the late 90s. And I went to a beautiful invited in only forum as part of the Mardi Gras Festival a couple of years ago, I think, and it was run by a very small grassroots organisation called Sydney Queer Muslims. They're unfunded, they get no money from anywhere, they are literally generally lesbian and gay, but some transgender people as well who are part of that community. And they were talking about a very similar kind of model. So we can have, you know, mainstream campaigns, and we can have white ribbon, or we don't have white ribbon anymore, but we can have all of those kind of mainstream movements. But they're only ever really going to touch the surface. They're not going to speak to people who have any of those levels of complication that stop us from walking through the front door of a service or identifying that we're in an abusive relationship. And what the Sydney Queer Muslims have done is they've worked really closely with a couple of imams, I think primarily quite progressive ones from Melbourne, around a different model of doing this stuff. So mainstream, you know, we come out when we're, you know, 18, or we come out when we're 30, or we come out when we're 70, and that has its own, you know, set of complications around it. And we can talk about the violence that older LGBTIQ women experience in a range of settings if you want, but that's a whole different conversation. But the premise of this group is you're inviting people into your story rather than coming out, and doing that in a powerful way. And it's not about men having the conversation or women or a particular gender having the conversation. It's about building solidarity with a whole group of people and saying, actually, this is something that builds our strength as a community, rather than saying it's about a men's message or a women's message, or this is how you speak to particular people.
So this is really fascinating to me. I've heard from two separate people, only one of whom is Muslim, how much outreach the Muslim community is doing. I'm fairly confident that I don't have any other religious types up here, and I'm not one myself. But does anyone in the audience know of other churches, temples, faiths who are doing this kind of research? Is anyone, or this kind of work? Hold on one second. I'm just going to hand over the microphone before you say a word. Sorry, because I got into trouble at lunch.
It's all right. The outreach is also happening in the Indian community through Hindu and as well as Sikh, through temples. But it's in a very small place at the moment. I'm part of a group, which is the Crisis Support Agency, Indian Subcontinent. And it is happening, but in a very minor way.
So that's Hindus and Sikhs? That's Hindus and Sikhs. Have I got any Christians, Catholics, Anglicans up the back? Hold on. Thank you. It's coming. Just trying to get a picture of this.
I may not be much help. I'm actually from the United States. So when I first came out here, I was actually struck by the fact that I didn't easily find those communities. I am Catholic and Latin American, and I actually found those communities quite available where I'm from in the States, which is really lovely. There was just really inclusive environments, also in Methodist churches, so a variety of different Christian faiths, but I have struggled to find that same community focus in the church here.
Catholic church here?
Yes, yeah. So there has not been as much of that building that I've seen yet.
Thank you. Coming up here.
I think you'd probably find that Pitt Street Uniting Church is very active in this area. The Uniting Church has been way ahead in terms of the LGBTI discussion and refugees and everything. and they have had, the last 2 ministers have been women.
I think
Anyone else from a church who can tell me what's happening in their church over there? Hold on, coming. We can't say anything until the microphone is in your hand. I get reprimanded.
Okay, I know Jewish House have a whole division around domestic violence. I know Hillsong have a whole section around domestic violence and also, helping crisis. So.
She's a whiz, isn't she? Thanks, Yumi. So, and you've got something as well? Sorry.
Yumi's running.
Sorry, I come from the Campbell Street Presbyterian Church, and they hold special consultations for families to make the men realise, and the women for that matter, I suppose, too, but to make men generally realise how they should be conducting themselves in the home.
Can I just add to that? I think the reality is it's only through the work of actually journalists, people like Haydar Gleeson and Julia Baird, who have pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. Like the work that they have done around Anglican clergy wives and the horrific abuse that those women experience, that is not just, swept under the carpet, it's actually the core of part of that religion. We're starting to push that stuff, but it goes back to the conversation that the women were having this morning. It's the institutions that have been exposed through various royal commissions that have abused older people, women, children, consecutively, who also hold a lot of power still, are the ones that are having to look at themselves, and they're not doing it quite as honestly as we would like them to.
So speaking of holding a lot of power, Alan Jones has had his... thank you, but hold on, I'm just going to get to my point now. Alan Jones, despite the fact that his advertisers have left him and there was almost no advertising in the last ratings period, he was still number 1 in his time slot, way ahead of everybody else. And he won the Ernies this year, that glorious event which happens at Parliament House, the most sexist thing ever. That was because he he wanted someone to shove a sock down Jacinda Ardern's throat. So what does that tell us about the acceptance of violence in Australia? Sharron?
Don't ask me.
I am asking you though, yeah.
Look, I think that... you just said the word Alan Jones and my whole brain shut down. Look, I don't and this is just my opinion, they're like bumholes, everybody's got one. And, but I don't underestimate the influence of the American politics that's going on, and the amount of avid right-wing nuttery that's going on, that has bolstered the silent undercurrent that used to be just bubbling along under the surface. I believe it's given Australian people who, with those kind of views, a voice that they felt they didn't have before, or they would just talk amongst like-minded people. It's given them the platform to say, well, the rest of the world feels like this. I mean, because everybody thinks that the USA is the rest of the world. But how can we have the US president espousing such sexist, misogynist, and a rape culture? To the whole world without there being some sort of ripple effect going on in our own country. And I think that, once you give somebody like that a platform, then it brings out the creeps from under the rocks, and they're out standing on their platforms.
And they are standing out there on their platforms. And of course, it's not just Alan Jones. It's also people like Kyle Sandilands. That's more your age group, Amani. Yeah, really.
Maybe when I was in high school, but...
Look, fine.
I feel like asking me about Alan Jones and then saying that's quite ageist.
Yeah. So Alan Jones is closer to my age than Kyle Sandilands, but I was just including others so people don't think it's just Alan Jones. It's all of them, really. Anyone who profits from being on commercial airwaves speaks about women in a really strange way. Sorry, Sam Newman, yeah. So that's my age as well. Go. Yep, Kyle.
I'm going to assume that we all know which group we're referring to, and say that they're all also racist, and that for me is kind of important because I've had to navigate both gender and marginalisation as a result of being a Lebanese woman, and then when I started to wear a hijab, being visibly identified that way, and grew up in an environment where Alan Jones would just go on the radio and say things, and we'd hear about it later, and we would know that there was someone out there that we didn't have any real interest in or listen to, saying things that affected my community. So I think for me, when they do say something misogynistic now, it doesn't actually feel like a shock. It feels like a continuation of who these people are and the way that they view the world anyway. And it's all kind of interrelated. So I've never felt that my feminism has been distinct from the other aspects of my identity, and things that are misogynistic make me as angry as things that are racist will make me.
Just a question. Does the panel think that it's a silent minority or is it endemic?
Okay.
Misogyny we're asking about. Is misogyny endemic?
Everybody has unconscious bias. And if you don't know you have unconscious bias, it's harder for you to question it. So a lot of me becoming a feminist and developing my feminism has been about interrogating my own unconscious bias. A lot of me understanding my political situation within the world is about questioning my unconscious bias. So it's not that there's a silent or a loud minority or a silent majority. It's everybody has a little bit of it in them. And the degree to which you feel comfortable expressing it and the degree to which you cultivate it will be shaped by the social messaging that's around you. And if the social messaging around you is endorsing it and not giving voices to people who challenge it, then it will continue to grow. And if you don't have the emotional awareness to identify that as a problem, then you will stay that way. And I think it's something that we all have to interrogate within ourselves. There's a program called DV Alert that you can sign up to and do online, and I didn't finish it, but I did sign up at one point. And the first module was about questioning unconscious bias. And at first I was like, what's this got to do with it? And then when I started to really understand it, I was like, well, this has opened up a whole new way of thinking for me that allows me to basically throw out all the things that I had internalized about myself as a female or as a woman of color or as a Muslim woman, and start to interrogate that. And that means everyone can do it. So I think it's not something that you can compartmentalize. You can't diagnose it like a disease. It's insidious and it's kind of everywhere, and we have to constantly be on guard.
So if I was in a classroom right now, I'd ask you all to bring out your iPads and think about your unconscious bias. Because I'm not in a classroom and there are no iPads, I just want you to speak to your neighbour for 1 or 2 minutes about what you think your unconscious bias is. Speaking now. Yep, good.
I don't like Australians very much. So I'm going to say some of this when you come back. Yeah, that's fine. I actually struggle with my bias about Elizabeth and capitalism. People were not productive. That is my biggest one. Well, yeah, that's what that has been my hardest one to challenge, and it's a class and social understanding. Yep.
I bet that was a very, very...
Rich conversation.
I bet that was a very productive minute and a half. Can I just say to you that up on this stage we have the woman on my right, Sharron. She's got so many unconscious biases she doesn't even know how to get past them to write the book she's in the middle of. Amani hates lazy people. Absolutely hates them and really struggles with the people who are not productive enough.
I did not put it that
Whatever.
way.
I'm paraphrasing because, you know, she's a lawyer and I'm just a plain-speaking journalist. And on the right, on the very far right, although that's not her usual position, is Moo, who really struggles with Australians. All right. So now we know what our unconscious biases are. Mine are so numerous that I don't have till tomorrow, so I'm not sharing them, and aren't I lucky to be able to say that? In 2018, Sarah Hanson-Young wrote an essay exposing the level of sexism and psychological violence she was exposed to. And that hasn't stopped, she's still being exposed to it. And that included threats of raping her daughter, so that's a favourite of trolls. I'm really hoping that they never named her daughter, because that's like the scariest thing alive. Why are women such a threat to men in power? Sharron, go. Moo. Amani, go, just go. Yep.
I think we have a real problem within our institutions of power, and some of the stuff that we've seen, not just in the federal parliament, but in the state parliament over the last couple of years, which has gone unchallenged, and it's certainly not exclusive to one side of politics in any shape or form. There's a lot of violence against women and support of violence and prejudice going on at all levels of politics, and our institutions are not brave enough to stand up against that stuff. And we see that playing out day after day after day, and it will continue to do so until a few brave people, and it needs to be men and women, stand up and say, actually, we're going to lift the level of conversation and the way that we treat each other. If you go down and sit in Parliament and listen to the way that they speak to one another, not just the abortion debate, anything, it is disgusting. We would not allow that in schools, so why do we allow people who are paid a crap load of money to do that?
There was a statistic somewhere that I read, and I wish I'd prepared a bit better so I could quote it for you, but it was something like there are more CEOs called Andrew than women CEOs.
David. Called
Australia?
David, and that was the
David.
that was the real meaning of diversity.
Okay.
Ba-boom.
So I think that the further away a person is from having the things that make you have proximity to power, so the further you are from that power, the more likely you are to challenge that power when you start to have some power. So I think people feel threatened by seeing a change in the status quo. I think women are potentially making some headway in the political sphere, and by at least having these conversations on the agenda, and that is not going to be accepted, or I guess you fight for your rights. They don't get handed to you. So I think there's a struggle in that process of actually taking our power and claiming it and gradually finding some equality.
But men didn't have to fight for their rights, did they?
Oh, they've built a world that provided it to them. So I think in a way they worked to establish those institutions that would guarantee them, and using the capital that generated, continued to reinforce those institutions.
Yeah. What about you?
Well, look, I equate everything to, what I've done for 30 years, that in a domestic violence situation where a man feels he's losing control, and the biggest way he feels he's losing control is a woman signals that she's not going to put up with it anymore and she may leave, he has to find stronger ways to push back. And often that means killing the woman. Now, I just believe that what we're experiencing now is, an uprising of women who are making gains and gaining some power, and the pushback is just magnified. When I first started working on women's refuges, people have said, has it gotten better? And I have to say, no, it hasn't. Despite our awareness, all the campaigns, all the gains that have been made by women working at the coalface and working behind the scenes and working on a holistic approach for violence against women, we have not made the gains. There has just been a bigger pushback. I believe that more women are being killed because they don't know how to gain their power any other way but to silence us completely.
Look, it's really interesting. I think that whole idea about, yes, please give her a round of applause. I think the idea about men controlling institutions is really a very good one, and I was shocked yesterday to discover that, I mean, I've always thought that the Labor Party was pretty good about gender equality. You know, they're close to 50-50.
Yeah, but sorry, Jenna, there's a lot of people in the Labor Party who sat there knowing that Luke Foley was a disgusting misogynist.
So I'm getting to my punchline. Yeah, thank you. But thank you, that's good. So until yesterday, I thought, okay, not too bad. They've got half, you know, women and men standing for seats, great. Then I discovered Emily's List has released a press release today saying that not once has there ever been a woman called upon to review the party. It's always been in the hands of men. National executive, always been, and I was shocked and a little bit disappointed. So even the Labor Party, which has held itself up as this great seat of gender equality, and I'm not a party member, I promise you, you know, they're lying to me, and that's made me sad, so I've written about that tomorrow.
Can I just add to that? Read Penny Wong's biography. I've got time now, so I'm reading for the first time in years, and understanding some of the roots of all of our political parties and institutions has to be a good thing. And there is as much, if not more, misogyny within, and I consider myself, you know, strongly left-wing, probably falling off the stage left-wing, and I've never been a member of any political party, but I can say these things now that I'm not, you know, that person that I was. I think all of our political systems are failing women, young women, older women. You know, we have these kind of nice statements, but actually it's the institutions like the unions and those parties that should know better that are failing us.
John Setka, please kill me. So I've got a question there. Thank you. Did I interrupt you then? I really didn't mean to. It was very good. Now I've got a question there with an orange top. Can someone just run? Yes. It's always me that has to give up the microphone. It's very hard.
If we all agree that that institutions are problematic and the power gradient is just against women, shouldn't we be looking at, so that you look at the leaders in those organisations, we look at Scott Morrison and then think, let's move to New Zealand. So maybe we should be looking at the areas that are like where there is strong female leadership, like Jacinda Ardern. Do you think that because if you look at the leadership and the influence of the leadership and the narrative and the language that they use, it's so different.
It's interesting to me that you say that. I've just finished reading some research by some women, obviously. Blair Williams from the Australian National University, Linda Trimble from the University of Alberta, and I've forgotten the other person from University of Auckland, and they have been through newspaper articles published in the 3 weeks after various women leaders were elected. We are worse today than we were 40 years ago. More gendered discussion of, for instance, Theresa May than there was of Maggie Thatcher. I mean, that's not to say that everyone is not more personalised. The research also tells us that men are treated in a more personalised way. But, for example, women's parental status is mentioned 5 times as often as men's parental status. So this is really depressing. Now, okay, we've got to go to questions, and I'm just going to ask you to respond to the lady in orange. Should we all move to New Zealand?
Well, they cloned Dolly the sheep. Can't they do that with Jacinta?
No, I don't. I don't think moving fixes it, because there'll be people who are forced for some reason or another to be stuck here. And I think when we treat countries as though they're separate to one another, and that the problems don't actually just flow all around the globe and stem from very like kind of core issues, then we overlook potential solutions. So the world is in a state of crisis, and we've started to sort of acknowledge that. And people have repeatedly been displaced because of war and other events all over the world. So I think when we talk about solutions to misogyny and racism and economic questions, we need to think globally, and our role as people who belong to a world that we actually have to share. And no matter how much we say our borders are defined and our laws are distinct, at the end of the day, we're all going to be influenced by the same forces if we don't think as global citizens. So for me, the idea of moving or wishing for a different government that we could probably just import from somewhere doesn't really work, because it doesn't look at the global issues that are shaping the world and causing these types of things.
Moo, do you have anything to add?
Oh, look, New Zealand's quite attractive at the moment, isn't it? For all of us, I think, in many ways. But I mean, yeah, also reading the media in the last couple of weeks, there's some, all is not well in New Zealand within Jacinda Ardern's government either. There are still misogynists and sexists and awful things going on there too. So,
I mean, has anywhere stamped them out? The answer is no. Now we've got about 12 minutes for questions. I'm giving this up unhappily. No, okay, fine.
Okay. Maybe on the New Zealand thing, one of the big differences between Australia and New Zealand is I don't think Murdoch's in New Zealand. Yeah. And I think, sure, there's misogyny everywhere, but, we've got to look very carefully. You don't have to look far to work out what has really shifted the culture, particularly in the lead up to the last election.
Yes, well, that is what the research says also, that it's worse in Murdoch papers. There's questions up here, about 6 of them, from 2 people. That's good. Yep.
We have the 2 of us. Look, I must admit I've been really troubled over the last few years thinking back to what I felt at Liverpool Women's Health Centre in 1975. I was overwhelmed by the oppression of women and the violence. I absolutely accept what you're all saying about the violence now, the pushback. I don't know as much about it as any of you. But Sharron, and also Moo, but Sharron, you've been at the coalface for 30 years. And I just heard you say you didn't think that things are getting better. And you said that's about 1988, which is when we had a lot of women's refuges already going then. And then we've had all these years of women's offices, lots and lots of policies. So, when did you observe times when it seemed to be getting better, and then did it get worse? It must be hugely difficult to have insight, but anything more you could say on that, I'd really appreciate.
Well, look, it's hard to say. I mean, you're dealing with burnout by the time you get to 20 years, but I have to say that there was a concerted effort to dilute the message about domestic violence, to genericise it, and then unfortunately there was a big push on to get rid of the New South Wales Women's Refuge movement. I can only talk about the state, and the strength that sisterhood had in being able to get a place at the table. Then the disastrous tenders were sent out, and we lost nearly all of our women's services to generic homeless services without any specialist focused on domestic violence or indeed on women themselves. Right. And they were handed over, wholesale to the large charitable church-based organisations, and that, I believe, spelt the death knell for us. It was the most disempowering thing that happened to me in my whole career, was to feel that we had lost a voice, a movement, and an ability to say this is wrong and it's got to stop. And I can't underestimate the devolution of the women's movement as being a part of that escalation. There was the pushback, there was the opening.
Thank you so much for asking that question, and thank you so much for that answer. That was just amazing, and it was so amazing, everything today, and coming up and saying that you worked with my mum in the women's refuge movement, which was awesome, and that you knew me when I was a little girl running around in the movement as well. That was just, and I literally, Annabelle had to give me tissues because I was crying through your whole singing process, the whole singing, and especially about the family law process, because I've literally been on 3 hours a night sleep trying to deal with that when you say, it's shut down the women's movement and they're not listening to us. We were down in Canberra 2 days ago and they would not even meet with us, they would not even meet with us or give us the benefit of a conversation. And we had every single women's organisation across the country. We've got a joint statement coming out. Actually, Amani's sister is the one that's trying to get it up at the moment, a piece running, because we've got 100 organisations across the country shouting out and saying, we don't want Pauline Hanson's family law inquiry. This is an unsafe process. And this is where it's at. So yes, it did demolish the women's sector, but we need to rise again, okay? So just calling on everybody to come together, band together. We're going to do this together. We all need to work together on this.
Just the whole process of taking women's refuges and the response to domestic violence at that level from the Department of Community Services and handing it to housing was a nightmare. I mean, maybe, and I say maybe Department of Housing knows how to house people, but they don't know how to deal with women. Yeah. They do not know what the complexities of domestic violence are. And, 15, 20 years ago, there was a big push on, I believe that language is important, to stop referring to women as women who came through our doors, refer to them as clients and customers. Yeah. The writing was on the wall then.
Jenna's giving me 1 second.
Yes.
I'm just saying there's a piece of paper on the back of the table. It's not just women's services that can put your name down. If you want to put your name down against this Pauline Hanson family law inquiry, you can put your name down on the table behind. Thank you.
That was quick. No worries. And I think I've got two over here. That person hasn't asked a question before, I think, or made a comment, and then the lady in front. Lady, do you hear how I was brought up? I'm so sorry about that. So sorry. Yes, carry on.
I'll try and keep it quick. Thank you. And I'm sorry I missed this morning, but I've travelled up from a semi-rural area surrounding Canberra. So my questions is around older women in semi-rural areas. And thank you, Sharron, too, because where I live, we're picking up the pieces from the decentralisation of women's services. And a lot of them are landing in holiday and caravan parks around Canberra. But we've also got older women who are really isolated and suffering some violence at the hands of their sons as well on properties and guns. But my main question or comment is around older women and dementia. So I live next door to a couple, a violent man, and she also was suffering from dementia, but the police continued to excuse his violence for her dementia. And part of that advocacy that I was doing for her in the end, where we got her out, and I was a witness at her guardianship hearing, also uncovered older women with brain injuries that they sustained during the 70s, and how there's gaps there about sort of the research that's been done, whether or not those injuries as a result of domestic violence are excused away for dementia as they're getting older. So thank you.
So that's terrifying, and there was, I thinking the police had improved. I'm so sorry. Do any of you have anything to add to that?
Look, I think conversely, we had issues with men who were being assessed by the ACAT team around their dementia, and it was just overlooked that their violence towards their partners was a feature of their dementia, when in fact they'd been perpetrating violence for their whole lives. It just escalated a little bit more, and they had the dementia as an excuse for it. The thing is that I think that it's the too hard basket. Nobody wants to look at it. If we can label the problem something else, and well, she's the problem, let's not respond. It's about the invisibility of older women and their devaluing of older women. Like, she has dementia. Doesn't she deserve every service that a woman without dementia should be afforded, regardless of the circumstances in her life at that time? But no, there's an out for the police. We don't have to deal with it. It's dementia. It's not going to improve. She's going to get worse. Let's not go out there.
Moo.
I think the reality is where we have no places for women like that, or men. It's hard enough to find a place for a woman who's homeless. That is a pretty tough call these days. Anywhere in New South Wales, doesn't matter if you're rural or regional or in the city. You add acquired brain injury, maybe 20 years of having your head smashed against the kitchen wall, and very little there's a real lack of recognition within the mainstream medical system about acquired brain injury and the links to intimate partner or family violence. You add the debacle that is, the disability system that we have here, and the fact that that's failing, many people, probably the majority. And then you add layers of, coercive control that might be going on either within the family through, family members or a partner, and then some dementia on top of that. It's too messy. It's too hard. Like, very few people or very few parts of the system are equipped to deal with that stuff. And Sharron, I don't know if you'd agree with me on this, but we have this weird thing within government policy where we talk about complex clients. I don't think there is such a thing as a client, as a woman, as a person who is escaping violence, male or female, who doesn't have a whole load of complexities. We sort of use this lovely language around we're all intersectional feminists these days, whatever that means. But actually, what it means is that we need to be dealing with people as human beings and looking at all of their circumstances and listening to what it is that they want from us, rather than trying to pigeonhole them into some kind of program if they're lucky.
Dealing with each other as human beings, I think that deserves a giant round of applause. Thank you very much. And we have one last comment or question.
Yes, it's a two-part question and it won't be long. Julia Gillard's misogynist, sexist speech, number one, did it really make a difference? Number two, for us, those of us who grew up in institutions as children, that were physically, psychologically, emotionally and mentally abused, that was a grooming process, and then subsequently sexually abused. We were victims of domestic violence by the government. We were the children of the government, okay? We suffer post-traumatic stress disorders, dissociated identity disorders, OCDs, drug and alcohol and everything else. Now, Julia Gillard called the Royal Commission the day that she was notified that she was being ousted, the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. So she's done a wonderful job. But in the meantime, do you believe that speech, I heard it on Facebook just the other day, did it really make any difference?
Hold on, we're just going to have a quick powwow. I think the misogyny speech had any, effect.
Fuck no. No. So you're a yes? No. Speeches. No. Yep.
Okay, so I think we've got 3 saying fuck no. But to close, we have Moo with a little item of hope.
I think it actually exposed the deeply entrenched misogyny that is within Australian society, and this is why I say I struggle with Australians. We have some stuff that is at the base of our civilization, 200 whatever it is years since we invaded this country, that is just commonly accepted as okay, and that's where our rates of violence against women, our excuse for violence against women, particularly within younger people, but also within adults as well. That stuff is deeply embedded within our society. And that stuff was exposed when Julia gave her speech internationally.
So it worked as consciousness raising.
Outside this country, yes.
Right. Can we please give our fabulous panellists a round of applause? Thank you for being such a great audience. I'm now going to out my sister-in-law, who's just sitting there, Katie Kavanagh, and is part of the Older Women's Network. There is nothing more terrifying than your sister-in-law holding up time cards. I want you all to know that. Thank you for coming.
Again, I would like to thank our fabulous panel and and thank them very much for their attendance.